It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be able to speak to you all tonight. I'm a huge fan of our native plant societies. We have obviously the Washington Native Plant Society up here in many different chapters, and I just love meeting knowledgeable people and people who are enthusiastic about our native plants and conserving our native plants. And sounds like you all are doing wonderful work down there in the Bay Area. In fact, I used to live down in the Bay Area for a very short amount of time, about 6 months. I worked for the Santa Clara County school system at a outdoor school or outdoor education site called Walden West Outdoor School. And in fact, I was just thinking back to that, and when Susan asked if we could put down our favorite bloom spot, I was thinking back to this trail we used to hike with students in the Stevens Canyon. And I remember you used to kind of come around a corner and then you'd get into this grove of California nutmeg in this little side canyon. And I recall that there was always Clarkia blooming around there. And I don't know, for some reason, that's just one flower that has stuck in my memory. That was over 20 years ago, but such an amazing, beautiful area, such great plant diversity. Susan said she was jealous of our edible plants up here, but I'm definitely jealous of all the diversity you have down there in California. All right, so I see there's maybe like 15 people on the call. I actually would be curious. I know I can't see all of your faces, but I would encourage you all to use the chat function if you can. And if anyone out there has a particular question that you want me to address over the next however much time we have here, feel free to put it into the chat right now. And I obviously have some prepared remarks, and I'm happy to just go through them. And but if you have something that you were really hoping to know, maybe I can try and make sure to address that, assuming I know the answer, which is not guaranteed. Yeah, so that's great. And then I will pause several times throughout the presentation, and I would welcome questions throughout the presentation. So if something pops into your mind, yeah, wait for me to pause, and I will definitely try to address it. Yeah, when I can at several points throughout the talk. Okay, great. So I see one comment in chat there. So let's see, I'll just read these out. I'm super curious about what is the function of Western sword fern in the food web ecosystem. Okay, great. So I'll try to address that. Let's see, do you know which Lepidoptera are hosted by ferns? Ooh, that's a great question. And off the top of my head, I do not know the answer to that question. Okay. Great. Well, I'll look out for more questions here in the chat, and yeah, we'll get started. So yeah, and I should say as a caveat, I am actually trained very generally in ecology and evolution. I'm not I'm not trained in the biology of sword ferns, and it's pretty interesting how I got into this work. Actually, my prior research had been on tropical birds, actually, and over the past 10 years or so, I have kids now. So my first child was born about 9 years ago. It became more difficult for me to get down to my research sites in Central America and South America, and I at the same time started a job in an environmental studies program where we're more interested in or at least the program itself is interested in questions at the intersection of people and the environment. And living here in this neighborhood in Seattle, I've gotten to know a lot of folks around here and some great naturalists who brought this problem to my attention in one of our local parks. And that's really how it all got started. And I realized, like, well, I have a whole flock of undergraduate students who are interested in doing research. And I began to think, okay, how can I get involved with this in my local city park here in Seattle, and involve undergraduates and also citizens. And what this has become is really a big citizen science project. I don't think we definitely don't have all the answers we're looking for, but I think it's a nice example of how a lot of people working together with various skill sets can accomplish quite a lot. And certainly learn a lot about the natural history of sword ferns, which is arguably maybe the best thing we've figured out, is just a lot more information about sword ferns than we previously knew. Okay, so this is about the die-off syndrome that we're seeing around the Puget Sound region, including and beginning in Seattle at a place called Seward Park. Okay, great. And I see, yeah, one more comment in chat here. Okay, so here we go. I want to start actually with a map, and I think, I don't know if I just, oh, okay. So this is a map actually of some of the tribes that are found in this area, some of the indigenous groups. I'm going to just move through this and skip to this map here. I'll come back to our local tribe, the Duwamish, in just a second. But just to orient you all, this is the Puget Sound region. If you haven't been up here, it's a beautiful place to visit. The Puget Sound is part of the Salish Sea, and the Puget Sound is the southern sort of arm of the Salish Sea, and it's obviously there's a lot of channels within Puget Sound. We are roughly in the Puget Trough here, which is a low-lying area between the Olympic Mountains and the Cascade Mountains. And the main vegetation type in the Puget Trough is known as the Western Hemlock Zone. It's a zone in which Western hemlock will become dominant if you leave the forest undisturbed for some period of years, probably 500 or more years. And, you know, historically, the return frequency for fire, for example, in Western hemlock is probably, in this Western hemlock zone, is probably around 500 to 800 years or so, depending on where you are in the zone. There are areas that burned more frequently, maybe as with a return cycle of 300 years or so. And those areas typically are dominated more by Douglas fir. So Douglas fir is another very common species in our low elevation forests, and you all of course are familiar with Douglas fir down in California. But Western hemlock is the more shade tolerant species, and it becomes dominant if in the absence of fire and other kinds of disturbance. And then, you know, we do have some oak savanna down here as well, but not nearly as much, or we have oak savanna up here in Washington, not nearly as much as you have down in California. And the oak savanna here was maintained, and to some extent still is maintained by indigenous burning practices, so the use of fire. So that sort of orients you a little bit to where we are and what this area is like. The arrow here points to Lake Washington, and this is really where the study began, on the shore of Lake Washington, roughly near the point of that arrow. This is South Seattle in a place called Seward Park. Okay. Great, so I'm seeing some good questions in the chat, which I will address. Seward Park, otherwise known as Spequops, is part of Duwamish territory. This is the Duwamish tribal land here. The Duwamish are not a federally recognized tribe, but the Duwamish people are still here, and this is their land. And I want to acknowledge that specifically along the lakeshore, the shoreline of Lake Washington, a band of the Duwamish known as the Hatchwaps were present, and still are present. They have a tribal longhouse on the Duwamish River. The map on the left is a recreation of the landscape in the mid-1800s and really shows this area along Lake Washington, heavily forested, the Duwamish River Valley more open, a meandering river. And then, let's see, I think I have another arrow here. The arrow, again, pointing to our main study site at Seward Park. It's actually a peninsula that juts out into Lake Washington. And historically, this peninsula was an island. The water level of Lake Washington was lowered in the early days of the city to facilitate commerce, and this island became a peninsula. The blue dots actually represent Duwamish named places, and the larger blue dots represent Duwamish village sites, historical village sites. So the Duwamish people have had a large presence in this area for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And one of the main points I want to make here is that you can't really understand the ecology of Seward Park's forest without understanding what the Duwamish people were doing here. And in fact, the Duwamish people burned parts of the Bailey Peninsula, which is this peninsula that Seward Park is on. And they maintained a series of prairies or oak savannas on the south side of the peninsula. And those oak savannas were used for gathering plants like camas and certainly gathering acorns. And so that's part of the Duwamish legacy. And we know that these fires also frequently burned across the peninsula. And we have actually on the peninsula, it's a western hemlock forest, but it's actually dominated currently by Douglas fir. And the large Douglas firs throughout the forest have burn marks on them from these fires that were set intentionally by the Duwamish people on the south side of the peninsula that occasionally must have also burned through the Conifer Forest. Okay, so a really interesting place with a long legacy of human use, and that legacy is important for understanding the ecology of this forest. But if you go more towards the north side of the peninsula in some of the wetter areas, north-facing slopes, you get into this, again, Conifer Forest. This is a nice example in Seattle of old-growth forest. We don't have much, really any old-growth forest left in Seattle except for here on the Bailey Peninsula. And again, dominated by large Douglas fir trees, also western hemlock in here, and some big leaf maple also in the understory. And you can see clearly here, well, sword ferns in the understory and some Oregon grape, 2 species of Oregon grape. And then in the foreground on the left side of your screen, you see a Douglas fir with burn scars on it. Okay, so evidence of these historic fires. I like to start my talks just by making some acknowledgements, and I know that seems strange to start in this way, but really the work I'm going to be talking about today is the work of many people, and I just want to make that really clear. This is not all me. And in particular, Paul Shannon, who's pictured here, is one of our volunteer stewards in Seward Park. He spends a lot of his weekends doing restoration work, pulling invasive species, all of the things I know you all are probably familiar with through your work with the California Native Plant Society. David Parasso, also involved in this sort of work, mostly at Martha Washington Park, which is one of the oak savannas attached to Seward Park. He's actually from California, David Parasso, and very passionate about oak ecosystems. And so he's been very involved with the sword fern work as well. Dylan Mendenhall, one of my former students who now has his own consulting business called Haven Ecology, has been also very involved in this work. Former and current students Natalie Schwartz, Kramer Knupp, Andres Barrera, and Justin Beach, also heavily involved in this, and a number of other folks too, who've been involved at various times. Marianne Elliott with Washington State University Extension Puyallup has been very helpful. She's an expert in forest pathogens. Al Smith with the Washington Native Plant Society. Catherine Alexander, I want to mention too, because she is one of our local citizen naturalists who really hikes every day in Seward Park. She's a wonderful naturalist, and she notices when things are not right. And she was the first person to notice the Sword Fern die-off and to bring this to all of our attention. And so just illustrating that, people who are out there hiking every day and just paying attention, taking note of things, is a really important service. And, who knows where we'd be if she hadn't noticed what was going on and catching this problem really early on. So we've had various funding from various people, including 100 Women Who Care, Washington Native Plant Society, Seattle Parks and Rec have helped a little bit, and Seward Park Audubon. A number of other people have been involved. So I just want to recognize that this is not all my work, and it couldn't have happened without this big community effort. And I think that's the most remarkable thing about this project, is how it's brought so many people in our community together. And a lot of these folks are not experts either. And so again, we're really just sort of crowdsourcing our knowledge. All right, so this is when we all get together, this is what it looks like when we go into the park to do our research. This is a joke, by the way. So I'm not sure how well this joke goes over when we're online here like this, but in case you couldn't figure that out, that's Joe Biden's motorcade going into Seward Park. And I just mentioned that because, I don't know how many of us can say that the President of the United States visited our study site. And he was here last year for Earth Day to announce his old growth forest protection plan. And he was in the Northwest anyway, and he wanted to do something in or close to Seattle, and they selected Seward Park as a backdrop for this big announcement on Earth Day. And so it's pretty neat to see the motorcade pulling into our study site. But anyhow, that was my joke. I don't know if that was funny or not, but let's get right into things here with the outline. Background. Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit more background, tell you what we're doing, what we're finding, and a little bit of discussion for the future here. Okay, so here we go. So here's some background. Most of you are familiar with Sword Fern. You've seen it in your redwood forests down there, and I know there's a little bit in San Francisco. It's a widespread species. It's adaptable. It ranges from Alaska down to Southern California, and patchily elsewhere as well. It can be found in full sun to deep shade, coniferous to deciduous forest. Although I think, most of us who have experience with sword fern sense that it probably thrives more in coniferous forest, in shadier, not full shade, but let's say mature coniferous forest is where we expect to find the most well-developed stands of sword fern. But it's you all know, if you have it in your garden, it's very tolerant of hot sun, full sun. Once it gets established, there's not much that can kill sword fern. And I thought I'd throw in this picture of Muir Woods too, from the National Park Service website. And this is down in your area, but you can see here mature redwood forest, and just the understory is almost entirely sword fern. It's a monotypical understory, and it's pretty hard to move through this kind of dense, tall sword fern. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. And I saw the comment there in the chat. If you know these ferns are big, they're tall, and they grow fast. Here's a picture from up in Washington. This is a more mountainous area in the foothills of the Cascades, colder site, but also quite damp. And you know, actually, these ferns have been depressed by snow a little bit, so they're not looking as vibrant here. But this is an early spring photo from the foothills of the Cascades. But again, you know, illustrating it's common in a variety of places, and in particular conifer habitat. Even in this very young stand of conifer, very dark understory, a little bit of sword fern growing in there. And I've seen it growing in clear cuts around here too. You chop down the trees, and the sword fern understory continues to thrive in full sun. Okay, so I've already showed you Seward Park, but here it is again. It's an early old growth. So early old growth is kind of a technical term, but it hasn't reached the Western hemlock stage yet, but we've got some pretty big trees, very old trees up to 500 years old, mostly Douglas fir. It's a remnant or a fragment of the forest that once cloaked most of the Seattle landscape. It's a robust forest, yet it shows signs of vulnerability, a lot of invasive species in it. It experiences some heat island effects, especially in the summer. It's exposed on all sides from warm breezes and sun. It experiences extremely heavy use by people and their pets every day. And during the 1930s, most of the coarse woody debris, that's CWD, was actually harvested out of the park for firewood. So that is one way in which Seward Park actually looks somewhat different from a more wild old growth forest in this region. Is it lacks some of the big logs on the ground and some of the big snags as well, because a lot of those were harvested and pulled out during the 1930s for firewood. And that may or may not be important, but it's for the ecology of sword ferns, but it's something to consider. We know that coarse woody debris is really important for the regeneration of our forests around here in the form of nurse logs, for example. So here's really the crux of the issue. The panel on the left shows a view of Seward Park's understory in 2011, and then a view from the same place in 2017. And you can see that it's pretty stark difference. And you know, these sort of repeat photos are extremely valuable, actually, and it really illustrates something that I think many of us were not really thinking about before 2011, but taking photographs of healthy forests, so important, because you never know how things might change, and to be able to document that change through time is really important. So we were lucky we had this picture from 2011, and that we were, you know, able to do this photo comparison. And we're taking a lot more photos now because it's really an easy way to document what you see and to document a snapshot in time. But you know, you have almost probably over 90% die-off of the sword ferns in this understory from 2011 to 2017. And it was in 2013 that Catherine Alexander first noticed the beginnings of the die-off. And over the next 2 years, from 2013 to 2015, it was crazy how these ferns were just dying like flies. You know, and really they haven't come back, which is the sad thing. And so we're working on that. Now, someone asked why do we care about sword ferns? And you know, there's a lot of reasons to care about sword ferns, obviously, and I think you all can probably think of some, but it's you know, for one thing, they hold the soil in place. And so you can imagine now this is not a particularly steep slope, so we're not too concerned, but if we start seeing die-off in very steep areas, it presents an erosion hazard. So that's, one sort of immediate concern, and especially near salmon-bearing streams, we get very concerned about this if there's runoff into salmon streams. Another reason is they provide important habitat for a variety of animals. There are birds that nest in sword fern. For example, the Pacific wren, very common species around here in our understory. They're certainly down in California too, in the redwoods. We also have a species up here called the mountain beaver, which is not a beaver and it's not found in mountains either. So not exactly sure how it got that name, but it's a small rodent native to the Pacific Northwest, endemic to the Northwest actually. And they're really cool little animals. They are extinct throughout most of the Seattle landscape, with the exception of Seward Park. They're common outside of the city, but they eat almost exclusively sword fern in the winter. And that actually was one concern of ours, that maybe the mountain beaver population had gotten too large or something, and they were eating too much of the sword fern. But really what the mountain beavers do is they just clip the fronds and pull them back to their hole and then nibble on the fronds. And you all who are gardeners know that you can clip the fronds in the winter. And in fact, many gardeners do that. You clip all the fronds off, and the new croziers open just fine in the spring. So I don't think mountain beavers are the cause of our die-off, but I'm more concerned now that with the loss of sword ferns, we might actually lose mountain beavers in this habitat. But there seems to be a relationship, a long evolved relationship, co-evolved relationship between mountain beavers and sword fern in the Northwest. Let's see, so there's other ways in which sword fern may be important, and this is a little bit speculative, but the sword ferns act as these giant baskets that trap debris coming out of the canopy, and arguably they can lead to slower release or more sort of systematic release of nutrients into the understory. And, arguably that could be important for the understory and the health of the soil. And it's, I don't think anyone has tested that idea or proven anything, but that's one hypothesis anyway. So those are some of the reasons that I think sword fern is important. But and beyond that, it's aesthetically a pleasing species. And it was also used as food by the Duwamish people. It's thought of as more of a so-called famine food, but edible nonetheless. Okay, so another question was about, is this problem evident in other areas besides Seward Park? And the answer is yes. We have an iNaturalist project actually where people can log their observations from other parts of the region. And since we first brought attention to this problem in Seward Park, people have identified similar issues in other places around the region. And those are shown by the red dots here. And, one of the things we've been trying to do is get out to all of these places shown in red to document what's going on and to try to at least get some sort of a snapshot survey so that we can document whether the problem is getting worse or better. But unfortunately, we have found it in other places around the region. Okay. This is another map. We've actually been trying to map the severity of these sites, and the places shown in red, the large red circles in this map, represent some of the more severe die-off sites that are as severe as what we see in Seward Park, where you have these very large areas of 90% die-off or more. Most of the other areas, I would say, are less severe at this point. So what we're doing, one of the things we've started doing is really describing the symptoms of the die-off. And that seemed to be a good starting point. We are also mapping the spread of the die-off, particularly in Seward Park, trying to figure out how it moves. We're doing some monitoring with long-term plots. We're searching for a mechanism of die-off. using various techniques, including physiology, transmission, experimental transmission of a putative pathogen, and monitoring throughout the region. And then finally, we're also doing some restoration work and trying to do that in an experimental way instead of just going out and planting whatever, wherever, trying to do that very systematically and trying to take data on what works and what doesn't and why. So to get into what we're finding here, let's talk about the description of the symptoms. And this is work that was led by David Parasso, who again is one of our citizen naturalists. I'm just going to plug in my computer. Give me 1 second. Okay. Great. And David Parasso, as it turns out, is a real fern expert. Unlike myself, who's a generalist, David is really interested in fern biology, and he actually propagates ferns at home in his house. That'll become important in a second, but he really led the way on this and started documenting through careful photography of basically following maybe 10 to 12 ferns for a series of years to figure out what are the stages of decline in these ferns. So in the early stages, we have isolated fronds showing signs of stress, pale coloration, maybe the leaflets are browning, rotting, maybe twisting. I'll show you more pictures of that. Middle stage of decline, most fronds displaying characteristics of stress and to complete wilting and drying and death of fronds. And then in the late stages, we see complete loss of fronds, leaving really just this little stump, or what we call a crown, on the surface of the soil. Okay, and the crown is part of the rhizome. And that crown may remain intact for several years without showing any kind of regeneration until it just rots away. So these stages that I'm showing you might take anywhere from maybe 2 or 3 years to play out. Okay, and again, David and his crew followed these ferns in Seward Park just to see what was going on, how it would play out. So here's an example of a symptomatic fern. And this actually is fern number 33. So I've forgotten. He had quite a number of individual ferns that he was monitoring, showing evidence of this one was showed sort of browning over time. And eventually this fern ceased to produce any new fronds. A couple other photos here, and looking at just some of the symptoms. I believe A is showing basically the fern is stressed and ceasing to put up new fronds. He also found some ferns with a twisted rachis shown in B. C here shows these crispate pinnae, so a little bit of twisting or twirling at the end of the pinnae, and then again D, discoloration. These are all symptoms that we've been seeing in the park and in other die-off areas. Aborted growth shown in panel E here, and then panel F, just the wilting of the tip of the fern, or dieback of the distal end of the frond. So these are all signs and symptoms that David Parasso, along with Dylan Mendenhall of Haven Ecology, that they have noted. Figure 10 showing this is an individual sword fern that died in actually another local park just across the water from us on Mercer Island, an island in Lake Washington. And it's amazing because this dead fern is here and it's growing in the middle amongst many healthy ferns. So something is attacking this individual fern, and it's not clear what it is, but there's healthy ferns around it. So it's hard to say what's going on, but one of the hypotheses that folks have posited is that it's drought stress, and that could be in part drought stress, but you would expect drought stress to affect all of the ferns in a given area. But initially, we tend to see individual ferns dying, and they're often surrounded by a sea of healthy ferns. Oh, interesting. So a comment here in the chat, the ferns in Devil's Gulch and Marin looked like this 2 years ago. Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned Marin. And I was just talking to Susan about this before we started. They had an issue and I don't know if this is the same place, but up in Marin County with thrips. And there were these little insects called thrips that were attacking the fronds, and they bore into the vascular system of the fern. And when the ferns are already drought stressed, these thrips cause even more stress on the vascular system. Their problem looked a lot like what we have, except that we have not seen thrips on our ferns, despite looking really hard for them. Like that was one of our first thoughts, was that, okay, this must be thrips. And we actually had Patrick Tobin, who's one of probably the top entomologist at the University of Washington, came out and had some students working on thrips on our ferns. And I think, they sampled a whole lot of ferns, and I think they found maybe one thrips in all of their sampling. And, we expect to see a few thrips, but it clearly was not an epidemic of thrips. So interesting. Yeah, but I'm very interested in what's going on up there in Marin County. So love to talk to you more about that if you know anything. But yeah, so eventually we get to this situation where, upper left, healthy ferns. The main panel here just shows what it looks like. You get a sea of dead ferns. And you can see here, these ferns have died recently. The brown fronds are still attached, but then the fronds just rot away, and we're left with these little fern stumps all over the ground. And it's really shocking and distressing. And for, someone who, if you love walking in our Northwest forests and being immersed in this sea of green, suddenly you're in a sea of brown, and it's scary, to be honest. It's like something is really not right, and what is nature trying to tell us here? That's sort of the big question. So I'm circling all the dead fern stumps here. So additional symptoms here, and this again is David Parasso's work. He started looking at the formation of new fronds, and what he began to see was, in these unhealthy ferns, the fronds simply were not opening in the spring. They'd start to form these fiddleheads, and then the fiddleheads would just never fully unfurl, and that would be the end of the fern. So he's cross-sectioned some of these, what he calls stillborn fronds.
This is another rhizome of a sword fern, much bigger one. This is a much older fern. But
I'm sorry. Hold on a second. I don't know why there's some background recording there on my PowerPoint, and that is strange. So I'm hoping I can turn that off. Okay, hopefully that doesn't kick in again. I had recorded a talk for someone else, and I'm not sure why that recording just kicked in. So we'll skip that slide. But this is a healthy sword fern.
David, your slides are no longer. I'm sorry, Tim. Your slides are no longer showing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, when you kick that out.
Yeah. I hope that recording doesn't kick in again. Very strange. All right, so let's hope we're good. So this is a healthy crozier, or healthy rhizome, actually, in this case. And this gets into sort of the natural history of sword ferns. And as we start digging up the sword ferns, we began to learn a lot about how they reproduce. And, probably 90% of the time they reproduce sexually, but a lot of their reproduction in a healthy, established sort of stand of sword fern just happens asexually. So every year they're adding on a new segment to their rhizome. And so you have the back end of the rhizome on the right side here, and then on the the front end, or it's shown on the left here, you have new growth occurring. And so gradually over time, the back end sort of dies and rots away, and you have new growth added onto the front end of the rhizome. And as far as we know, these ferns can live for hundreds of years. And that was one of the remarkable revelations that we had in doing this work, is that these ferns are probably as old as the trees themselves. So like 300 to 500 years old. We have no reason to suspect that these ferns die because they just seem to add a new segment to their rhizome every year. And so this is a nice illustration of a cross-section of the rhizome. And on the left, you see these fiddleheads, known as croziers in more technical terminology, emerging. I'll move forward here. And so, you know, a healthy fiddlehead, you know, you see this nice sort of swirl pattern to them. And so it's a healthy cross-sectioned crozier, just so you can see what that looks like. And I mean, they're beautiful. They're amazing plants. So you expect these new fronds to expand right around now, this time of year. And so we're seeing this out in the forest. And again, more pictures. The sori become reduced or absent on the second and third year fronds. So each frond will live for up to 3 years. And so every year a new ring of fronds is added. And then, you know, after 3 years, the oldest fronds, the 3-year-old fronds, start to die and wilt away, shunting their nutrients back into, probably shunting nutrients back into the rhizome before they die. And so that's sort of the process here. And they don't produce sori after their second year. But this, again, this is what we see in healthy sword ferns. I'm moving through this fairly fast in the interest of time, but in our unhealthy sword ferns, we can cross-section these rhizomes again. And what we see is basically you're not seeing new croziers being formed. And if they are formed, they don't open. Okay. So in this case, there actually aren't any new croziers developing on this symptomatic sword fern. Okay. And again, healthy on the left, unhealthy on the right. It's these aborted croziers. Okay. So in summary here, we have early signs of die-off showing some combination of the following: browning of all fronds, reduced production of new fronds, reduced sori on new fronds. Okay, so that healthy fronds have produced lots of sori, but in a stressed plant, they are not going to produce sori. Twisting, crinkling, browning, wilting of leaflets and or frond tips. Aborted maturation of fronds. And I'd say this last one is really the key. So there's a lot of things that can cause browning, wilting, but if you look into the center of your sword fern and you see that it's not producing new croziers, and you'll see the croziers coming out in the middle of winter, but this time of the year, if they're not unfurling, if they're not produced or not unfurling, then you know that you've got a problem and that this fern is probably going to die very soon. So that's really what we're looking for. And again, you know, this was through some very careful observations by a group of people led by David Parasso and you know, former student of mine. And you know, it's not complicated work. It's just careful study of a very common species of plant that grows pretty much everywhere around here. So, and we've learned a lot from studying what we thought was, you know, basic knowledge that probably should have been known. And maybe it was known, but not recorded before. So yeah, that's summary of the first section here. Are there any questions that I can answer up to this point?
It looks like you're keeping up with all the questions so far, so if you wouldn't mind proceeding.
Okay, well, hopefully I'm not boring anyone to death, but you guys are plant people, so I hope you find this really interesting. So yeah, we'll keep going. So one of the things we wanted to do in Seward Park when we first noticed the die-off was, okay, we got to figure out, like, is this something that is spreading? And if so, how fast is it spreading? Yeah, so I see another question here about pathogens, and Robert, maybe we'll come back to that, and you might need to clarify for me what SODS is, but I promise we'll come back to pathogens. But yeah, so we want to know how fast this thing is spreading, what's going on. So we worked on a few ways to do this. We came up with some rules to define spread or die off, and we said 50% of the individual ferns at a given site, 50% or more, have at least 30% of their fronds dead, then there has been some sort of infection occurring, okay, at that site. So in the first year, actually in 2013, the die-off had affected about half an acre. By 2014, it had affected 5 acres of the park, and by 2017, we had seen a doubling again. Okay, so very rapid initial spread, and now we're at over 10 acres of affected sword fern population. So basically, almost complete die-off in most of this area. So that was sort of the initial spread through 2017. We started using some other techniques after that. Okay, but pretty rapid and alarming spread. And again, to go from lush green to brown, for people who are plant biologists, people who care about plants, you notice this and know that, wow, something is really wrong. And let's see, so now we've started a sort of a different way of monitoring this, and we've started looking at smaller patches of die-off and trying to figure out, we've ceased to see this sort of wholesale spread of the die-off, and what we're seeing now in Seward Park is a more patchy distribution of die-off, to where we see sort of a new patch cropping up on the north side of the peninsula. There's lots of sword fern between the south side and the north side, but for whatever reason, we're not seeing like wholesale spread through some of these healthy areas, and the die-off seems to be a little more patchy at this point. So not quite sure what to make of that, although you do see that it's close to the edge of the park now, and so maybe exposed to different kinds of stresses, but that's just a I don't know, a not well supported hypothesis. Hard to know. Here's one example in 2021 of a new die-off invading a healthy patch of ferns. And actually, we're monitoring this site very closely. And I'll come back to that. Okay. Okay, so I'm actually looking at a question here from Heather Brown, question about how common these mysterious die-offs are. It's not sword ferns. And that's a great question, Heather, and I maybe should have said at the outset, we're seeing a lot of different species becoming stressed around this region. In particular, big leaf maple has been showing die-off around the region. It's not clear that, it's not the species like in imminent danger of extinction or something like that, but big leaf maples are very stressed right now. What else? Western red cedar is quite stressed in some places. Western hemlock also quite stressed in some places, and actually in Seward Park we're seeing real die-off of Western hemlock, and I think that has to do with some of our very hot weather that we're having in the summers, and Western hemlock in particular is known to be not tolerant of hot temperatures, and we're seeing, I think, the effects of climate change on Western hemlock. In the understory, we see a little bit of stress on some of the berberis, the Oregon grape, but which again is strange because that's a species that should be fairly drought tolerant. But it's not. We're not seeing a die-off of berberis. We're seeing it's some of the plants look stressed. So yeah, I would say that we're in a situation where there are a lot of stresses happening, whether that's introduced pathogens, whether that's hotter weather. You all know about this in California too, and it's like, how much can our native plants tolerate when they're being pushed from so many different angles in ways that they're historically not used to being pushed? So I hope that answers your question. Oh yeah, and then Robert is talking about sudden oak death syndrome. And Robert, I don't know about sudden oak death syndrome. Yeah, and I apologize for that. Is that one of the Phytophthora diseases, or is that an insect-borne disease?
Yes, sudden oak death is Phytophthora, one of them.
Okay, so we have done a lot of monitoring for Phytophthora with our sword ferns, and we actually had Marianne Elliott, who's the real expert plant pathologist in this area, working on that. And that was our initial thought, was it was behaving a lot like a Phytophthora disease, and she worked so hard trying to find Phytophthora, and it just, we weren't finding it, at least not in any quantities that would suggest that was the issue. But she was so sure it was Phytophthora, and she spent years, well, like 2 or 3 years, working pretty hard on that. And she's a real expert on Phytophthora, so I certainly trust her results. One of the things we were concerned about was she had found Phytophthora on sword ferns in a nursery in this area. And we started getting really scared about, well, should we be planting out sword ferns from nurseries? And are we introducing Phytophthora diseases this way? And it turned out, I think it was just one nursery, but it raised a lot of concern. But anyway, at the end of the day, it's not Phytophthora. But we thought for sure, because of the way it seemed to be spreading. And although Phytophthora can be waterborne, so you would expect more spread downhill as the water flows downhill. And we began to realize that it wasn't flowing, the die-off wasn't necessarily spreading downhill, which made us think, okay, maybe, yeah, there must be something else involved. But Phytophthora can be spread by animals too, or by human footprints. That's one thing to think about too. And we have all kinds of people's dogs running around the forest, not to mention researchers' feet. So a lot of ways things can spread. So getting back to the slide here. So one of the things I started doing with my students was just simple monitoring, and really just getting some baseline data. And we set up 20 monitoring plots around the forest, and we have been surveying these roughly every year. We've slowed down a little bit. They're 3 meter by 3 meter permanent plots, and we measure them. We count every single fern stem in these plots, and over time, initially, 2015, our plots had about maybe 5% dead ferns. From 2015 to 2016, our plots went from 5% dead to 30% dead, and just need to look at this. These are actually dead ferns, not dead fronds. So 120 ferns across all 20 plots, went from 5% dead to 30% dead, and so on, increasing to 2018 was, I think we have one more survey that's missing here, but by 2018, half of the ferns across these plots, some of which were located near the initial die-off, some outside of the initial die-off, we saw over 50% of the ferns completely dead. And to look at this another way, you can also look at the number of fronds per plot. And sorry, I just can't see my screen because there's a taskbar in front of things. But yeah, average number of live fronds per plot. And, you know, this is just another way to look at the same thing, counting per frond. And we have thousands of fronds that we count every year. Although, as you can see, with every year, there's a lot fewer fronds to count. So yeah, average of 20 fronds per plot in 2015 down to just over 5 fronds per plot in 2021. And then, you know, breaking it out by individual plots, you can see that some plots have shown pretty steady decline, whereas other plots like plot number 5, plot 20, and plot 7 have shown, in some cases, just a little slight fluctuation or even increase over time. And so we're pretty interested in these 3 plots and why are these 3 plots more or less thriving and everything else showing decline. I don't have an answer to that question, although I would say that here's some photos from plot number 7. It's a plot with a very rich understory. It probably does have some maybe slightly higher moisture content for whatever reason. It's closer to the center of the forest, maybe less vulnerable to some of these edge effects. And very diverse understory too, with Trientalis, the western starflower in the understory. It has madrone reproduction, several species of berries, a lot of very diverse understory. And actually, interesting enough, it also has what does it have? It has poison oak in it, which is very unusual around here. I know you all are familiar with poison oak, but so we get a little bit of poison oak fix in Seward Park. But yeah, so trying to figure out what's going on with plots like plot number 7, these plots where the ferns seem to be holding on pretty well. Has a large grand fir next to it, which is interesting. So we've started to think about, does the canopy species composition matter? So yeah, so interesting. So question here, does diversity provide a modicum of protection versus a monoculture? And I think, there's probably some truth to that, because, like any disease, diseases tend to move through, dense monoculture type populations. So yeah, so Susan's asking about mycorrhizae, and I'd say that's a big unanswered question right now that we're very interested in. And yeah, so how do we get at the mycorrhizal question and the mycorrhizae that are associated with ferns? We've thought a little bit about this, and I offhand I'm forgetting which mycorrhizae sword ferns have, and whether they share mycorrhizae with any of the canopy species. My recollection is that they don't share mycorrhizae with any of the major canopy species, but I'm sure that was the thought that popped into your mind, Susan. So yeah, and maybe it really does matter what species they're growing next to, and how healthy those species are. So I think that's something we definitely need to look into a bit more. But I recall that, we shied away from it a little bit based on some of the initial research we had done. And this is an area where you're going to need a little bit more expert help for sure when you start getting at the below ground processes, particularly fungi. One of the things we did find through some mapping of the die-off in these dead zones was that, in fact, there were some ferns that survived, and that survivors tended to be closer to logs or live trees on average. Okay, so there's a little bit of a pattern there. Why is this? It's hard to know, but again, well, thinking about moisture, so trees draw moisture from the soil towards their base. These big logs on the ground too act like sponges and can hold moisture in place and or potentially release moisture. So, so there's a little bit of suggestion that, these hotter summers we've been having may be stressing the plants out, and that proximity to moisture could be helpful. But I say that with a little bit of a caveat, because we do have some very wet areas in Seward Park, which are swampy and harbor, different other ferns like lady fern, which is a very moisture tolerant fern. And some of our worst die-off right now is happening in these moist areas, which is just kind of confounds me, because you want like a simple solution, like, well, yeah, it must be just drought stress, but it really doesn't seem to be that, at least not entirely, because again, we see some severe die-off in some of the wettest areas of the park. But yeah, at this particular site, yeah, there seems to be some connection to the survivors being near mature trees or dead wood. And that has informed our restoration efforts a little bit as well. So, again, this is, not complex stuff, but it's just a large group of people all interested in the problem, and we're doing, experiments in a coordinated way to figure something out about the place where we live and a species we all care about. So here's a brief summary of what I just told you. Okay. So we still have spread of the die-off, but it's patchier now and not as severe, which I think has also led us to sort of back off a little bit. We've had a little bit of burnout on this. We were all working so hard on it for so long, and some of us are taking a little step back now, that it seems to be slowing a little bit, but we'll see. One of the things we're actually, so going back to the question about mycorrhizal fungi, we're trying to get funding for environmental DNA analysis, where essentially you can sample the soil, the air, really anything, and it allows you to rapidly sequence any DNA that happens to be there and match those sequences with fungi, known fungi or known pathogens, to try and, it's a little bit like a needle in a haystack, but it's a little bit, it's well enough developed at this point that you can actually, with environmental DNA sequencing, get a pretty good idea of what is or isn't there in your environment. And costs a little bit more money, getting beyond sort of these very rudimentary experiments that anyone can do, but that's something we're interested in doing. So the big question, and I sort of alluded to this, is drought causing the die-off, and that's what I want to get to now. Oh, okay. So drought versus pathogen, and this has really been the big debate amongst all of us, and in particular with Seattle Parks and Rec, that we're really pushing this drought hypothesis. And it's convenient to be able to say, well, it's drought. Like I said, though, there's enough evidence in my mind that we see some severe die-off in the wettest areas of the park. We also don't really have a drought happening right now, depending on your definition of drought. But the last 10 years haven't been droughty by Washington standards. Now, that said, we have had some extremely hot weather in the summer, and that obviously can cause drought-like conditions. So I'm not trying to rule this out completely, but yeah. So I'm looking at Susan's comment again. Started in an area and spread from there. I would say it's something in the soil. Bacteria, nematode, virus, amoeba, fungus, etc. Yeah, exactly. And you're right, drought and heat would not be so localized. So, maybe I can move through this quickly, but, I've sort of given you a lot of our initial observations here. So in the interest of time, I'll move through this. I'm sorry that this recording keeps kicking in, and I'll have to figure out what's going on with that. So we'll skip those slides in the interest of time and because of that background recording. But one of the things we've been doing is looking at chlorophyll fluorescence, which is a simple test you can do with a fairly expensive machine, as it turns out. But we can look at the photosynthetic activity of the ferns in real life in the forest by clipping these little photosynthetic monitors onto the leaves. And so this is an experiment done by Dylan Mendenhall, where we're looking at healthy ferns and symptomatic ferns, and using this measure called FV over FM, which is a measure of photosynthetic activity. And basically, the symptomatic ferns are showing less photosynthetic activity. Okay, and that can be caused by problems with water uptake, because water is a limiting ingredient. Okay, and in particular, they show this lower photosynthetic activity in the summers, and the summers around here are quite dry. We don't have the fog at Seward Park that you guys have in San Francisco, and we don't get the fog here that is on the outer coast of Washington either. And in fact, so Dylan also looked at foliar moisture content, and what he showed was that healthy ferns from Seward Park and a nearby park called Schmitz Park had higher foliar moisture content than symptomatic ferns in Seward Park. So there seemed to be a reduction in photosynthesis and a reduction in water uptake in symptomatic ferns. So that's, a clue that something is affecting water uptake. What is it? We don't know. But I think that to really cut to the chase here, I think there is a pathogen that probably affects water uptake. So in the drier months, and in particular in this hotter weather that we've had over the past decade or so, unusually hot days, we these two things, a pathogen that affects water uptake and the hot dry weather, somehow combines to kill these ferns. So that would be my best guess at this point. Okay, so these are moving through these results and summary pretty quickly here. Okay, so die-off is likely caused by a pathogen that exacerbates water uptake. Okay, so here we go. So evidence for pathogen, up to now it's pretty much hand waving, but this is an interesting experiment that Paul Shannon did with Dylan Mendenhall, where they took ferns and placed them in bottles of water, and they had two treatments. They had a control treatment where they took a healthy fern frond and paired it with another healthy fern frond in the same bottle. Then they had a so-called infected treatment where they took a healthy fern frond and paired it with a symptomatic fern frond in the same bottle. Okay, and what they were hypothesizing was that a healthy frond paired with a symptomatic frond would begin to show signs of symptoms. Basically, it would begin to show symptoms because of transmission of a putative pathogen from the symptomatic fern to the healthy fern. And one of the ways that they looked at symptoms was, again, measuring this chlorophyll fluorescence as a way of testing how stressed the fern was, not just how it looked. And in all cases, so let's see, we have the treatment shown in gray, the control situation shown in gray, that's healthy, and the infected treatment shown in yellow, that's healthy with unhealthy. In all cases, after you leave these ferns together in a bottle of water, after 5 days, you start to see the healthy ferns in this infected treatment declining significantly or more rapidly than the control treatment in their ability to do photosynthesis. suggesting that, yeah, there's something moving from the infected fern into the healthy fern that is causing that healthy fern to decline more rapidly than it would otherwise decline when placed in a bottle of water. Okay, so that's some evidence for transmission of a pathogen. And getting to what Susan said, this is behaving a lot like a bacterial infection that in this case is moving through water or through basically the xylem tubes within the fern. So something about the vascular system of the fern, something in the water inside the fern is able to move via water into the other fern, into the healthy fern, or it could be via an animal vector that for example, thrips, although we haven't seen thrips or any other insect that would do this, but who knows? Maybe mountain beaver saliva or something. That would be interesting to test. Although, actually, I joke, but I did actually test this idea by building mountain beaver exclosures to try and keep mountain beavers out of certain areas of the park, and it turned out that the exclosures didn't seem to have any effect. We got die-off inside the exclosures too, even when mountain beavers theoretically weren't there. So I think we can rule out mountain beavers. But anyway, we see transmission happening here, and I'm going to show you one other clever experiment that Paul Shannon again led, looking at transmission of a putative pathogen in the field. So we have this circle here that I'm going to call it, imagine a map looking at the ground. Within this circle, we have a zone where all the ferns are dead. Okay, and the hypothesis here is that the ferns are dead, so there's no host for the pathogen. So the pathogen has run its course, it's now absent. We have areas outside of this circle where die-off is still happening actively. Okay, and so we hypothesize that in this active die-off zone, the pathogen is still present and active. Okay, and this pathogen, putative pathogen, has moved outwards from the center of presence. So, and in fact, this is a pattern we see in Seward Park. We have the initial die-off zone, almost everything died, and then we have active die-off happening outward from the initial zone. So what Paul decided to do was, and this is part of restoration now, plant ferns in the old die-off zone, the original die-off zone, and he planted ferns in the active die-off zone. And the hypothesis was that ferns in the old die-off zone would survive because the pathogen is absent there. Ferns planted into the active die-off zone would die. And that's exactly what he did. He planted 2 rows of ferns in the old die-off zone and 1 row of ferns in the active die-off zone. And what he showed after monitoring this over a period of years, and again, prediction being that the planted ferns in the active die-off zone will become symptomatic, that prediction was borne out. So you have active die-off zone on the left, number of fronds per fern is significantly lower than the number of fronds per fern in the old die-off zone where the pathogen is presumably absent. So this again illustrates that there seems to be a pathogen working here as opposed to simply drought or drought stress. Yeah, that this pathogen seems to run its course in a way, and that from a restoration standpoint, restoration is possible in areas where the pathogen has run its course. And I guess that's the good news here, is that we've started to plant ferns and other understory species now into these areas where the die-off seems to have run its course. And it seems to be working so far. And here's what that experiment looks like in real life. These are all planted ferns. All the original sword ferns died in this area. And this is after 50 months, the ferns still showing good survival here. Okay. So again, summary here, in the lab, symptomatic ferns seem to spread symptoms to asymptomatic ferns via water, presumably, although that's a question mark. In the field, we see greater mortality in the active die-off zones, okay, as opposed to areas where the die-off has already run its course. And so there seems to be some sort of transmission occurring through the environment. The question is how? And we have yet to figure that out. Okay. So in summary here, the die-off is characterized by gradual death, failure to produce fiddleheads, decreased ability to take up water. The die-off is still active and spreading, but perhaps less virulent, or at least the death rate seems to be lower. We see some new sites for the die-off, including Mercer Island, Tiger Mountain, and the north side of Seward Park. We see die-off throughout the region, but very few sites as severe as Seward Park, and that's encouraging to me. I have one site that I'm monitoring on Bainbridge Island that is quite severe, but after 3 years of monitoring doesn't seem to be expanding. So that's some good news there. The mechanism of die-off is a probable pathogen, which seems to cause damage to the vascular system, and that's exacerbated by summer drought and heat. Okay, so that's sort of what we know. And actually, one other thing I was going to add is that David Parasso, the real fern expert in our group, and this is not his full-time job. He's retired, but he's super interested in ferns. He actually was able to collect the sori from some of the surviving ferns at the center of the worst die-off. And he was able to cultivate or breed those ferns and cultivate them in his basement and backyard. And with the idea that these ferns might hold some sort of genetic resistance to the pathogen. And what we've started doing is planting these ferns out into the park. And right now, final experiment we're doing is planting these ferns along with control ferns from a nursery into an active die-off zone to test the idea that these ferns that he cultivated, the survivors, we call them the Lazarus ferns, to see if they possess some sort of genetic resistance to the die-off in an active die-off zone as compared to controls that we're also planting out there. And so far, I just checked this the other day. It seems like the ferns that he cultivated from the survivors seem to be showing more robust growth than the ferns from the nursery. And now that there could be different reasons for that, and time will tell whether the nursery ferns actually die and David's ferns survive. But it's encouraging anyway, and again, testament to real dedication of a volunteer who has just devoted a lot of his retirement to understanding fern biology. And I'm just so inspired and impressed with these folks who are just enthusiastic, smart people who want to get involved in science. And we've all been together collaborating to do some, I think, really clever and interesting experiments, and giving us insight into this really troubling issue, just showing that people who are interested and dedicated can do good science with very little in the way of resources as well. So I think I just described this experiment, and that's what it looks like. And again, planting near coarse woody debris as well, and continuing to monitor. And in fact, another encouraging sign is some of our ferns that we thought were dead, and this is very rare, maybe are coming back to life. And this photo is from our study site, but I was reminded of a photo that I saw from Big Basin where you guys had those huge fires that went through, and it seems like some of the sword ferns that burned away in these hot fires are now the rhizomes have recouped enough energy to put up some fronds again. And so that's again, testament to just how hardy this species is. But again, despite its hardiness, I don't, we can't take it for granted that they're going to be here forever, and they obviously are vulnerable to these stresses that are probably exacerbated by the effects of climate change that we're seeing here and that you're seeing in California. So, not to continue too much, we're doing a lot more monitoring of other species as well. We're getting community engagement, youth involved. It's really inspiring to get kids working with us.
Yeah.
And we have photo monitoring stations set up too. And that's a really neat thing that I'd encourage anyone to do anywhere. There's an organization, which I don't have on the tip of my tongue, that will help you set up posts for where anyone can put their phone camera on top of the post and take a picture of in the same way from the top of the post anytime they happen to be in that area. And then there's a code that you scan and it sends your picture into this database. And we have these monitoring stations set up around Seward Park now, and anyone who hikes in Seward Park with a phone can contribute to our database of monitoring change in the forest through photos, and it's really awesome. So with that, I've talked for a really long time. I hope you enjoyed this and found it informative. So I'll be happy to take questions. Oh, and some great questions in the chat. So Susan, are you being careful not to bring bacteria, virus, fungus from infected spots to healthy spots on your shoes? Yes, we are. I think in some cases we could be more careful. And some of our researchers actually clean their shoes with bleach. Yeah, absolutely. And especially if we're going to places outside of Seward Park, I always clean and change my shoes. So yeah, because we don't know what's going on. The reality is, though, in an urban park like this, everyone would have to be changing their shoes, unfortunately. And we have hundreds, if not thousands, of people hiking in Seward Park every day, and stuff gets moved around in today's world. And but yeah, absolutely, as researchers, though, I think we bear a responsibility to demonstrate by example. So yeah.
We've got a question from Bob Hall about whether or not you're considering replanting with additional diversity than just restoring the ferns.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was one of the first questions. Yes, absolutely, we are. And we, again, like to do this in a way that, we're taking data as we go. And surprisingly, this is something that hasn't been, I'm sure there are many folks like you all who are involved in restoration, and I don't know how often people keep good data sets, but we haven't kept the best data sets on restoration in Seattle Park. So we're trying to change that, and we're trying to keep track of which species have the best survival. And also doing things like, does it matter whether you water them throughout the summer? Obviously, not surprisingly, water helps. But we want to make sure that everything we plant has the best chance of survival possible, which means paying attention to how much water do they need, which species do we plant, etc. And so the one that has the best survival right now is snowberry, Symphoricarpus alba. I think you probably have that down there too.
Yes, we've got it too. It's understory.
Yeah. So yeah, a very hardy plant. And but we plant Ulnaria cerasiformis, otherwise known as osoberry. Trying to think of various of the berberis, which used to be Mahonia. A lot of things. But the Symphoricarpus seems to be doing the best, and so we're making a big push for that. But diversity obviously is important, because who knows, Symphoricarpus might not be the best at some point in the future. But yeah, right now we just want to get something in the understory for habitat, but also for soil maintenance. Because the soil, one thing we noticed was the soil was beginning to bake up pretty hard. We have this glacial till here. Yeah, it really gets baked in the summer if there's nothing shading it, when there's no leaf litter on it.
Yeah, we have a lot of the same plants. We've got a different bearberries. We've got pinnata, not aquifolium, but we have the snowberry, we've got the soberry, and those are our understory plants as well for our woodland.
Yeah.
But it's good. So what tools are you using to track what you're adding and what's surviving in terms of diversity?
Well, very, very simple tools. And I would say this is, in this case, it's a little bit more led by Paul Shannon, who's our forest steward. So he'd be the best person to answer that question. But, he has simple data sheets. He knows, we got flags out there. He knows what he's watering, what he's not. We pay a lot of attention to how things are planted. We use mulch in some cases, or no mulch. And for a long time, we used no mulch, and that was sort of standard in Seattle parks. But it's pretty clear that mulching helps. And then the question is, how much mulch? And we just got a huge load of mulch into Seward Park, and going to be experimenting with different depths of mulch for, presuming holding in moisture. Maybe, mulching could be a double-edged sword in a way, because you sometimes don't know what you're introducing with mulch, but it seems on average that mulch helps. So, but just careful sort of writing up a protocol, following a protocol, and then labeling the plants so that you can follow them for multiple years. And what we realized was that we were seeing like maybe less than 10% survival of everything that we planted. And this was before Sword Fern die-off even. We realized, like, wow, this is a heck of a lot of effort and money going into this for such low survival rate. And to some extent, in nature, you obviously have low survival rate, but we could be doing better. And we realized that by tweaking certain things, we can do better. And watering helps. And but it seems like a lot of work in water. But if that's, it's cheaper to do that than to just be planting more and more things every year, hoping that something survives. So, maybe encourage the toxicodendron. I love it. That'll cut down on the foot traffic. Great comment from Heather there. Believe it or not, I have thought about that. It's just no one wants to plant it, and I'm not exactly sure how to encourage it. We talked about controlled burns too. That would never happen, but it's possible that's what is needed as well. Anyway, fire is a whole other thing too, but we need more. Honestly, the toxicodendron probably will start spreading anyway if we keep getting hotter, drier summers. So it's amazing. The south side of this Bailey Peninsula is a lot like California. We got this little oak forest there. We've got a lot of poison oak through there, like very thick stands of poison oak. And then you move over to the high part of the peninsula and the north side, and it's more like it's a Pacific Northwest. I won't say rainforest, but obviously moist conifer forest. So pretty amazing to see those microclimate differences and how that affects the vegetation. So
Bob Hall's asking, are invasive species filling the void, or any other native successional species moving in?
That's a great question. I would say you've probably heard of Stinky Bob, Herb Robert.
I did not know that plant.
Okay, well, Geranium robertianum. It's a small geranium. It's quite pretty, to be honest, but it's highly invasive around here. It also smells bad when you crush the leaves. It seems to move in pretty readily, and we have an issue with that. And I'd say that's one of my biggest concerns right now in these areas that are devoid of sword ferns. The only way to stay on top of it is just to come through and pull it. And one of the folks I mentioned at the beginning, Al Smith, is retired, and he has basically devoted his days to biking around to the parks in this area. He's very, very committed to low carbon footprint, and pulling weeds. And through his work, his effort, I'd say Seward Park, thankfully, has very few invasives relative to so many of our other parks. We have very little ivy, and it's the conditions right now are ripe for ivy to take over, but thankfully there's not really a seed source or root source in the die-off areas. So so it's an issue for sure. And this is another reason why we're trying to get on the restoration. So
we're fighting ivy in all of our parks. Someone thought that was a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, we have holly too, English holly. And interestingly enough, Seward Park was a place where there was like the English Holly Club in early Seattle, early 1900s Seattle. And someone thought, yeah, we need a lot of holly in Seattle, and we're going to create a special holly grove in Seward Park. And that's what they did. And sure enough, we're dealing with holly everywhere. Well, not everywhere, again, thanks to efforts of volunteers, but it would be everywhere were it not for the volunteers. So it's crazy. It's just like we're going to be involved with this ecosystem forever, and I don't really know what it's going to look like in the future. No one does, obviously. Maybe it won't be a forest forever. Maybe it won't be a conifer forest forever. We certainly want it to provide all the benefits for the community that it does, and certainly the benefits for wildlife. It's hard to see all of these threats. So ecosystem needs our help. We're, like I say, I started with the Duwamish history, and I think we're reminded too that, the Duwamish people also stewarded this place, and to some extent our ecosystems have co-evolved with people, and we need to continue acting as stewards, and maybe that's just the way it is, and the way it always was. So
that's a really good point, and something that's so meaningful to us in the Yerba Buena chapter, because so many of us volunteer in our local green spaces taking out invasives. So thank you for reminding me that it's not just since we got a bunch of invasive European and Australian and Asian plants. We have that people have been stewarding these spaces for millennia. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm really struck by that in the oak ecosystems, and of course you have such extensive oak savannas down there, and in these spaces and the plants that evolved in them exist large part because of the way people manage them for millennia. And I've seen photos of I guess you can find still like these I don't know what you call them, but little sort of rock bowls, right, where people were pounding acorns historically.
Yes.
And you know what I'm talking about, right?
I do. Yes, absolutely.
And it's just people have been there forever. Well, for millennia anyway. Yeah, Heather's asking, can we blame the hydros or the Blue Angels? You sound like a Seattle local now. We thought about that. And yeah, you know, so we have this air show that happens every summer over Lake Washington, and these fighter jets release the smoke, which I don't know, has some chemical in it. And yeah, we thought maybe a jet dumped some fuel or smoke over the peninsula, and that somehow affected the ferns. But we don't really have any evidence of that. But it's, yeah, I mean, at this point, like, all hypotheses are good hypotheses, or most hypotheses are reasonable. So yeah, but yeah, the hydros and the Blue Angels are contentious here. So yeah, you got to be careful about which side you find yourself on. So anyway, yeah, great.
This presentation has been such a wonderful way. I don't think I've ever seen such a great presentation about how science works. It's like, identify the problem, try to approach the problem, how different, approaching the different ways of discovering whether or not it might be this or that issue. This is beautifully described. If you don't mind, I'm going to recommend it to a bunch of people who I know who are in schools, because it's a great way of showing how you can do science, especially citizens involved with it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm glad that impression sort of hit home with you, and I agree. Yeah, and it's been very rewarding. Yeah, and I'm glad I was able to explain it in a way that shows how science works and how the story kind of unfolds. So, and yeah, like most science, there's always more to know. So the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? So, and I think, yeah, that's a good take-home message as well.
Thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful presentation, and for all the work that you and your community are doing to investigate this and share how that is done with those of us down here. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and thank you all too. And I hope to make it down your way sometime in the not too distant future, and partake of your wonderful plant diversity and the work you're doing. So yeah,
so much. We'd love to see you down here.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, thanks again, and it was a pleasure. So yeah, and if this is recorded, you know, send me the link, and it might be useful for me to have the link as well. So.
Okay, it'll be a few days before it's up on our website, but it will be recorded, and I will send you the link.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good night, everyone. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And let me know if you see die-off down there. Definitely want to know what's going on. So
yeah, I mean, if unfortunately we do we join your INAP project, or yeah?
Yeah, that'd be great. Or, you know, you could start by emailing me. I don't know how connected you all are on email, but
Yeah,
we can figure something out. So
good plan.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Night.